Something about this situation feels way bigger than just a diss track, because when a woman like Remy Ma decides to speak, she's not just venting, she's sending a message. And this time, that message landed directly on Claressa Shields, with Papoose caught right in the middle. What started as quiet tension behind the scenes has now exploded into full-blown public drama, and the timing couldn't be more intense. Because just when people thought things had cooled off between them, Remy dropped a track that didn't just throw shade. It pulled back layers that weren't supposed to be seen. But here's where it gets complicated. Reports are swirling that Papoose isn't staying silent this time. In fact, sources claim he's warning Remy to dial it back, before he starts revealing things that could completely shift how people see this entire situation. And if you know anything about their history, you already know that's not a light threat. Now the internet is split. Some are saying Remy is finally telling her truth, while others think this is about to turn into something much messier than anyone expected. Because once music turns into personal receipts, there's no going back. To really understand why this situation is hitting as hard as it is right now, you have to go back to the foundation of what Remy Ma and Papoose once represented. For years, they were seen as one of hip-hop's most solid couples, the kind of relationship people pointed to when they talked about loyalty, endurance, and what real commitment looked like behind the scenes. Their story carried weight, because it wasn't built overnight. It was tested publicly, privately, and in ways most celebrity relationships never survive. So when cracks started showing, people didn't just see drama, they saw the unraveling of something that once felt untouchable. During the earlier years, especially while Remy was away dealing with her legal situation, Papoose built a reputation as the man who held everything down. He was vocal about standing by her, supporting her, and making sure her name stayed alive in the industry. Interviews, appearances, even subtle mentions in his music all painted the same picture: he wasn't going anywhere. And when she came home, that image only got stronger. They stepped back into the spotlight together, presenting a united front that fans believed in. It looked like loyalty had won. But behind that image, there were always whispers. Not loud enough to dominate headlines, but present enough to make people question whether everything was as perfect as it seemed. Some insiders claimed that the balance of power in their relationship wasn't as even as it appeared. There were rumors that Papoose had played a bigger role in shaping parts of Remy's music than he publicly admitted, while others pushed back on that idea, saying Remy's pen was always her own. It became one of those debates that never fully got resolved, just quietly sitting in the background while their public image remained intact. Then slowly, things started to shift. The energy between them wasn't as visible as it once was. Appearances together became less frequent, and when they did show up, something felt different to people who had followed them closely. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing you could point to and say, "That's the moment everything changed," but the tone had definitely shifted. And in celebrity culture, those subtle changes rarely happen without something deeper going on behind closed doors. That's when Claressa Shields entered the conversation in a way nobody expected. At first, it didn't seem like anything serious. Just interactions, comments, public admiration that could easily be brushed off as harmless. But over time, those moments started stacking up. Interviews where she spoke highly of Papoose, moments where she described the kind of man he was, and the type of support she valued. It all started sounding a little too specific for people not to notice. And once the internet picks up on patterns, it doesn't let go. Eventually, what had been speculation turned into something more public. Their connection became harder to deny, even if the full details of how things developed remained unclear. And that's where things started getting messy. Because depending on who you listen to, the timeline doesn't fully line up. Some sources claim that the relationship between Papoose and Claressa began after things had already fallen apart with Remy. Others suggest there may have been overlap, or at the very least emotional lines being crossed before anything officially ended. None of it has been definitively confirmed, but the uncertainty alone was enough to fuel the conversation. For Remy, this wasn't just about a relationship ending. It was about how it ended, and how it played out in public. Because from her perspective, it seems like she wasn't just dealing with a breakup. She was dealing with a narrative being built around her that she didn't fully control. Reports started circulating about her own personal life, including alleged involvement with battle rapper Easy the Block Captain, which added another layer of complexity to everything. Suddenly, instead of one clear storyline, there were multiple versions of events being discussed all at once. And in situations like this, perception becomes everything. Because while one side is trying to tell their version of the truth, the other side is being shaped by public opinion in real time. For a while, it seemed like Papoose and Claressa were managing that narrative carefully. They didn't come out aggressively, they didn't feed into the drama too much, but they also didn't fully distance themselves from the attention. It was a controlled kind of visibility that kept people talking without giving away too much. But for Remy, staying silent was never really her style. Especially when she felt like her name was being used in ways she didn't agree with. There were moments where she hinted at frustration, moments where she pushed back subtly, but nothing that fully exploded into what we're seeing now. It was more like pressure building under the surface, waiting for the right moment to release. And that moment seems to have arrived with this latest track. Because this wasn't just music for the sake of music. This felt targeted, intentional, and layered with things that only someone close to the situation would even think to say. The references, the tone, the confidence behind it all suggested that Remy wasn't guessing anymore. She was speaking from a place of knowing, or at least from a place where she felt justified enough to put it all out there. At the same time, the reaction from Papoose adds another level to the story. Because historically, he hasn't been the type to jump into public back and forth situations unless he feels directly challenged. And according to what's being said now, he's not just irritated, he's prepared to respond in a way that could bring even more details into the spotlight. And if that actually happens, this situation could shift from controlled drama into something much harder to contain. What makes all of this even more complicated is the fact that legally and technically, Remy and Papoose are still tied together. This isn't just two people who dated and went their separate ways. There's history, there's paperwork, there's a shared legacy that doesn't just disappear overnight. And when something like this plays out publicly while those ties still exist, it creates a level of tension that's hard to ignore. Meanwhile, Claressa finds herself in a position where she's both central to the situation, and yet somewhat outside of its original foundation. She didn't build the history between Remy and Papoose, but she's now part of the conversation surrounding its breakdown. And depending on how this continues to unfold, her role could either stabilize or escalate things even further. So now everything feels like it's sitting on the edge. One diss track has already shifted the energy, and the response that may or may not come next could change everything again. Because once people start speaking through music instead of silence, the lines between personal and public disappear fast. And right now, it doesn't feel like anyone involved is ready to step back. As soon as that track hit, the entire energy around this situation shifted from quiet tension to something a lot more direct and a lot more personal. Because what Remy Ma delivered didn't feel like a casual jab or a quick emotional release. It felt calculated, layered, and intentional in a way that made people stop and really listen to what was being said between the lines. The tone alone told you this wasn't something she threw together overnight. This had been sitting with her, building, waiting for the right moment to come out. And the moment she chose. That's what made it hit even harder. Because by the time this song dropped, Papoose and Claressa Shields had already been moving in a way that suggested they were comfortable being seen together. Not overly loud about it, but not exactly hiding either. Public appearances, interviews, subtle comments, everything added up to a situation where people were already connecting the dots. So when Remy decided to respond, it didn't feel random. It felt like she was reacting to something that had been building publicly for a while. But what really got people talking wasn't just the fact that she responded. It was how she did it. Because instead of addressing things directly in interviews or social media posts, she went straight to what she's known for, music. And in that space, she has control. She can say what she wants, how she wants, and leave just enough room for interpretation that people start dissecting every word. That's exactly what happened here. Listeners weren't just hearing bars, they were analyzing tone, timing, and intention. Every line became a potential clue, every reference something people tried to connect back to real-life events. And then came the parts that felt a little too specific to ignore. There were moments in the track where it sounded like she was questioning authenticity, hinting that someone in the situation was trying to present themselves in a way that didn't fully match reality. Without saying names directly in every line, the direction of the message felt clear enough that people didn't need it spelled out. Social media picked it up instantly, breaking down lyrics, comparing them to past interviews, and trying to figure out exactly who each line was aimed at. That's when Claressa Shields really became the center of the conversation. Because while she's known for being outspoken and confident, stepping into a situation like this, especially one tied to a long-standing relationship like Remy and Papoose, puts her under a different kind of spotlight. And based on what's being said, Remy didn't hold back when it came to how she sees Claressa's role in all of this. There were suggestions of imitation, hints that certain moves weren't as original as they seemed, and even subtle digs that people interpreted as personal. Now, whether those interpretations are accurate or not, that's where things get tricky. Because in situations like this, perception can quickly turn into assumed truth, even when there's no clear confirmation. But the impact is still real. Once those ideas are out there, they stick. And for Claressa, that means dealing with not just the original situation, but the added layer of public scrutiny that comes with being called out in a song like that. At the same time, you can't ignore how Papoose fits into all of this. Because for years, he's been known as someone who stays relatively composed, someone who doesn't jump into drama unless it directly involves him. But this situation, it involves him on multiple levels. His past, his present, and the way both are now being discussed publicly. And according to reports and insider chatter, he's not exactly pleased with how Remy handled this. What's interesting is that this isn't just about defending his current relationship. It's also about how his contributions to Remy's career are being framed. Because one of the underlying tensions here seems to revolve around that long-standing conversation about whether he played a role behind the scenes in her music. It's something he's hinted at before, something that's been debated for years, and now it's being pulled back into the spotlight in a much more direct way. And from his perspective, that might feel like a line being crossed. Because it's one thing for personal relationships to change. It's another thing for professional contributions to be publicly dismissed or questioned. Especially when those contributions were, at least in his view, made from a place of support rather than recognition. So when Remy's lyrics appear to downplay or push back against that narrative, it adds another layer of tension that goes beyond just who's dating who. That's where the idea of a response starts to carry more weight. Because if Papoose decides to respond the same way, through music, this could escalate quickly. Not just in terms of back and forth diss tracks, but in terms of what gets revealed. Because once artists start responding in that format, there's always the possibility that more personal details get pulled into the spotlight. Things that were once private suddenly become part of the narrative, whether they were meant to be or not. And according to what's being said, that possibility is very real right now. Sources claim that Papoose has been warning Remy to ease up, to stop pushing things further before it reaches a point where everything gets laid out. Now, whether that's an emotional reaction, a calculated move, or just speculation being amplified online, it still adds tension to the situation. Because it suggests that there's more to the story than what's already out there. Meanwhile, the public is split right down the middle. Some people feel like Remy is justified in speaking her truth, especially if she believes her name has been dragged or misrepresented. Others think this should have stayed private, especially considering the history involved. And then there's a third group that's just watching it unfold, waiting to see what happens next, because they know situations like this rarely end quietly once they reach this level. What makes it even more complicated is the fact that all three individuals involved have strong public identities. Remy as a respected rapper with a reputation for speaking her mind. Papoose as someone associated with loyalty and composure. And Claressa as a dominant figure in her own field who isn't afraid to stand her ground. When personalities like that collide, the outcome is rarely simple. And right now, it feels like everything is building toward a moment where someone makes the next move. Whether that's another track, a public statement, or something completely unexpected, the tension is there. And the longer it sits unresolved, the more attention it's going to attract. Because at this point, it's not just about what's already been said. It's about what hasn't been said yet. What makes this moment feel different from everything that came before isn't just the diss track, or the responses people are waiting on. It's the fallout that's already starting to reshape how all three names are being viewed in real time. Because once something this personal crosses into music, it doesn't just stay between the people involved. It becomes public property. It gets debated, dissected, and reinterpreted by millions of people who weren't there for the private moments that led up to it. And right now, the way Remy Ma is being seen is shifting depending on who you ask. Some people are praising her for standing in her truth, for refusing to stay quiet when she feels like her name has been dragged or her story has been twisted. They see this as her reclaiming control of a narrative that may have gotten away from her over time. But on the other side, there are people questioning whether this was the right move, especially considering how much history she shares with Papoose. They're asking if turning something so personal into public content only makes things harder to resolve, especially when emotions are already running high. Because the reality is, this isn't just about a breakup, or even a new relationship. This is about years of history now being pulled into the spotlight again, but from a completely different angle. And once that happens, there's no clean way to separate what's personal from what's performative. Everything starts blending together, and the truth becomes harder for outsiders to fully understand. At the same time, Papoose is in a position that feels almost like a crossroads. For years, he built his image around loyalty, around being the man who stood 10 toes down no matter what. That identity didn't just come from what he said, it came from what people believed they saw over time. And now, with everything unfolding publicly, that image is being tested in a way it never really has before. Because no matter how this situation is interpreted, there are going to be people who question whether things were handled the way they should have been. And then there's Claressa Shields, who has gone from being somewhat adjacent to this story to being directly in the center of it. And that shift brings a different kind of pressure. Because now, it's not just about her own career, or her own public image. It's about how she's perceived within a situation that already had a strong emotional foundation, before she was ever publicly connected to it. And whether that's fair or not, it's the reality of how these kinds of stories play out. What's interesting is how each person involved is handling the attention. Remy chose to speak through music, which immediately set the tone for everything that followed. Papoose, at least so far, is being described as someone who's weighing his next move carefully, possibly deciding whether responding publicly will escalate things even further. And Claressa has maintained a level of confidence in her public appearances, continuing to speak positively about her situation, while avoiding getting pulled too deeply into the back and forth. But that balance feels fragile. Because the more this situation stays in the spotlight, the harder it becomes for anyone involved to control how it evolves. Social media doesn't just observe, it participates. It adds theories, assumptions, and sometimes completely new narratives that take on a life of their own. And once those narratives start gaining traction, they can influence how people interpret everything that comes after. You're already seeing that happen now. Old clips are resurfacing. Past interviews are being reanalyzed. Comments that didn't seem important at the time are suddenly being viewed as potential clues to something bigger. And the more people dig, the more complicated the story becomes. There's also the question of how this impacts their careers moving forward. Because while controversy can bring attention, it doesn't always bring clarity. For Remy, this could reinforce her image as someone who isn't afraid to speak her truth, but it could also open the door to more scrutiny about her personal life. For Papoose, the decision to respond or stay silent will likely shape how people view his role in all of this. And for Claressa, navigating this moment carefully could determine whether she's able to keep the focus on her own accomplishments, or continues to be tied to this narrative. And then there's the emotional side of it, which often gets overlooked when situations like this go public. Because beyond the headlines, beyond the speculation, these are still real people dealing with real emotions. History doesn't just disappear because circumstances change. Feelings don't just switch off because a relationship ends or evolves. And when those emotions get expressed publicly, especially through something as powerful as music, they tend to come out in ways that aren't always easy to take back. That's why this moment feels like it's sitting on the edge of something bigger. Because right now, it could go in multiple directions. It could escalate into a full back and forth, with more music, more statements, and more personal details being shared. It could settle down if everyone involved decides to step back and let things cool off. Or it could evolve into something even more complicated, especially if new information starts coming out that changes how the situation is understood. And that uncertainty is what's keeping people locked in. Because at this point, it's not just about what's already happened. It's about what happens next. Will Papoose actually respond the way people are expecting? Will Remy double down, or choose to move differently after this? Will Claressa step in more directly, or continue to stay focused on her own lane? Those are the questions hanging in the air right now, and none of them have clear answers yet. What is clear, though, is that this situation has already left a mark. The dynamics between these three names have shifted in a way that can't be undone, at least not publicly. And no matter how it plays out from here, people are going to remember this moment as a turning point. Because sometimes, it's not the beginning of a story that defines it, it's the moment everything changes. Now I want to hear from you, because this situation is getting more complicated by the day, and honestly, the lines between truth, emotion, and public perception are starting to blur. Do you think Remy Ma went too far with that diss? Or was she simply defending herself after staying quiet for too long? And what about Papoose stepping in now? Does he have a right to respond? Or is this something that should have stayed private from the beginning? Then there's Claressa's role in all of this. Do you believe she's been unfairly targeted? Or do you think she's been adding fuel to the fire behind the scenes? Every angle of this story feels layered, and depending on how you look at it, the narrative can completely change. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those situations where everyone sees it differently. If you enjoyed breaking this down with me, make sure you like the video and subscribe, so you don't miss what comes next. Trust me, this story is far from over, and the next move could change everything.